We're in Genesis 30 today. We're going to look at Genesis 30, just the first half of it. Before we get started in it, though, a quick question. What size family did you grow up in? And where were you in the birth order? I was number 7 of 11. 1 of 5, 2 of 4, 1 of 3, and the youngest, huh? 3 of 3 then, huh? 4 of 6, yep. 5 of 5. 3rd of 9? Oh, I didn't know you had 9 in your family. I mean, I knew this, but I didn't, right? I have to connect pieces. I turned to Roger this morning and I said, happy birthday as I was coming in. And Janelle goes, do you know it's my brother's birthday today too? I'm like, it is? She's like, Glenn. I'm like, oh, I knew that. I just forgot that you were related. Was there, or maybe I should say, is there, a competition between you and your siblings? If so, what over? You don't have to answer that one. But I will say this. You all know by now that I come from a large family. I'm number 7 of 11 kids. And while we were growing up, and even to this day, there was never something specific that we all, had a competition in. But boy, could our board games get pretty heated. There wasn't a specific competition that we all wanted to win. However, we do have just a generally competitive spirit. We like to play games, and when you play the same games with the same people over and over again, of course it's going to get a little competitive, right? But that's just a surface level competition. It's nothing like the competition we're going to see here in Genesis 30. Now, this chapter starts by finishing what's happening in the last chapter, and then it moves on to another event in Jacob's and his family's life. So we're just going to go through again the first 24 verses, and we're going to connect them back to chapter 29 today. So I'm going to start reading in chapter 29, actually, verse 31, and I'm going to read through verse 24 of chapter 30. So let's dig in. Starting in verse 31 of chapter 29. When the Lord saw that Leah was hated, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. And Leah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Reuben, for she said, because the Lord has looked upon my affliction, for now my husband will love me. She conceived again and bore a son, and said, because the Lord has heard that I am hated, he has given me this son also. And she called his name Simeon. Again she conceived and bore a son, and said, now this time my husband will be attached to me, because I have borne him 3 sons. Therefore his name was called Levi. And she conceived again and bore a son, and said, this time I will praise the Lord. Therefore she called his name Judah. Then she ceased bearing. When Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she envied her sister. She said to Jacob, give me children, or I shall die. Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb? Then she said, here's my servant Bilhah. Go into her, so that she may give birth on my behalf, that even I may have children through her. So she gave him her servant Bilhah as a wife, and Jacob went into her. And Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. Then Rachel said, God has judged me, and has also heard my voice, and given me a son. Therefore she called his name Dan. Rachel's servant Bilhah conceived again, and bore Jacob a second son. Then Rachel said, with mighty wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister, and have prevailed. So she called his name Naphtali. When Leah saw that she had ceased bearing children, she took her servant Zilpah, and gave her to Jacob as a wife. Then Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a son. And Leah said, good fortune has come. So she called his name Gad. Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. And Leah said, happy am I, for women have called me happy. So she called his name Asher. In the days of the wheat harvest, Reuben went and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, "Please give me some of your son's mandrakes." But she said to her, "Is it a small matter that you have taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also?" Rachel said, "Then he may lie with you tonight in exchange for your son's mandrakes." When Jacob came from the field in the evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, "You must come in to me, for I have hired you with my son's mandrakes." So he lay with her that night. And God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. Leah said, "God has given me my wages, because I gave my servant to my husband." So she called his name Issachar. And Leah conceived again, and she bore Jacob a sixth son. Then Leah said, "God has endowed me with a good endowment. Now my husband will honor me, because I have borne him 6 sons." So she called his name Zebulun. Afterward she bore a daughter, and called her name Dinah. Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her, and opened her womb. She conceived and bore a son, and said, "God has taken away my reproach." And she called his name Joseph, saying, "May the Lord add to me another son." We're going to pause there. Dennis, do you want to come teach this lesson for me? All right, so we close chapter 29, right, with Leah giving birth to 4 sons. I wanted to read that just to kind of refresh our memory. Now we start chapter 30. We see how Rachel felt about that. Is she happy that her sister has had children? Is she just reveling in the position of being an aunt? No. What are her feelings towards Leah? Jealousy, resentment, envy, right? In fact, she was so jealous that she demands that Jacob give her children, or she threatens to die. Now remember that Rachel was the one that Jacob desired in the first place. Her position as his wife was once secure, but now she is taking a lesser role. Having a desire for children is healthy, but Rachel's jealousy is kind of inexcusable, and her impatience is kind of wrong, maybe even sinful. Look at Jacob's response to Rachel. What are his feelings toward her in verse 2? He's angry. His wife has demanded something of him that he can't do. In fact, he highlights this. He rightly points it out. He essentially says, "Am I God?" He correctly points out to her that her pregnancy or children come from the will and power of God alone. But Jacob does miss a step here. Remember when Jacob's mother, Rebekah, was barren? What did Isaac do? He prayed. He went to God. While responding to anger with anger is a naturally human thing to do, Jacob should have taken a step out of Isaac's playbook and have brought the problem before God, and even have prayed to him and done it together, possibly with Rachel. So that's the first thing that we can learn from our passage today. We're going to learn 2 things right away. First, we need to bring the problem to God and seek His direction, rather than trying to fix it ourselves. But also, we can learn that the Bible can teach us what not to do. Jacob responded to anger with anger, and he just skipped over what he should have done in the first place. The absence of prayer still teaches us that we should pray. But unfortunately, he omitted something that he should have done in the next place, and we'll see this here in a second. He did something that he shouldn't do. But I feel like we've seen something like this before. Look at verses 3 and 4. When's the last time we've seen something like this happen? In Genesis. Yeah, Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar. They tried to accomplish God's promise in their own strength. Rachel is trying to do the same thing here. So apparently they didn't learn the lesson that human ambitions and human actions were not going to accomplish the covenant. Now, a better translation of the Hebrew actually shows up in the King James Version here. Rachel says in verses 3 and 4, in my version, ESV, she says, "Here is my servant Bilhah, go into her so that she may give birth on my behalf, that even I may have children through her." The King James Version says, "Behold my maid Bilhah, go in unto her, and she shall bear upon my knees, that I may also have children by her." So the phrase, "bear children upon my knees," is actually more of the literal Hebrew there. And it's a phrase, it's another way of saying that Rachel will take the children that her servant bears and set them upon her own knees and treat them as her own. Essentially, she'll bear them, but they will be hers. But unfortunately, Bilhah's wishes were not even consulted, right, in this matter, and nor will Zilpah's wishes either. And here's the thing that happens. Jacob doesn't resist this. He doesn't put a stop to it. He doesn't say, "No, this is wrong. I already have 2 wives. I shouldn't have 2 more." He just goes along with the flow. He and Rachel completely ignore the sanctity of marriage. The lesson that Abraham and Sarah learned was discarded. Jacob and Rachel were trusting in their own strength. Look at verses 5 and 6. Bilhah conceives, and Rachel says, "God has judged me and has heard my voice and given me a son." So this union between Jacob and Bilhah was successful, just like it was for Abraham and Hagar. A son was born. And what was his name? Ishmael for Abraham and Hagar, and here for Jacob and Bilhah? Dan, yes. Both are right. And notice Rachel's response in verse 6. Her response is indicative of something unfortunate that happens even today, and even for ourselves. When people sin or do something wrong, and it seems to work out for them, they tend to baptize or sanctify their action. They say that God must have approved of what they did, and thus it's okay. Have you seen some of those things happen in the world today? Here's an example. I think of those abortion stories where a woman kills her child and then goes on to lead a successful life. Thus, God must approve of her right to choose. That is some, I use this in light quotes, Christians' rationalization of this. Or the man who thinks he's a girl and undergoes procedures to make that happen, and afterwards attributes the good feelings that he has towards God giving him peace with his decision. You see how you take a sin, you think it works out, and you try to sanctify it, right? Or try to make it, or rationalize that it's right. We could go through a billion of other examples, each as equally as dangerous as the others. Now, why would I attribute that to what's happening in this passage? Well, first, we know that marriage is sacred, right, between one man and one woman. Second, we know that God did not approve of Abraham and Sarah doing the exact same thing. And third, we know that Rachel is only doing this out of her jealousy. And finally, nowhere in this passage does God approve of what happens here. We only have Rachel saying that he approves, and only for her to feel vindicated in her own sight and the sight of others. Always remember to be discerning while you're reading God's word. Who is speaking? What are they saying? Why are they saying it? Just because it's in the Bible doesn't mean that it's a positive lesson for us to learn. Sometimes, many times, I'm going to come back to this, the Bible also teaches us what not to do. And I think that's part of the beauty of the Bible. It contains a completely truthful account of humans throughout history, all of their shining moments and all of their faults as well. And this particular fault, letting the end justify the means, is one we need to be on the lookout for in our own lives as well, and in the lives of others. Resist the temptation to believe that the end justifies the means. But just like Joseph, where his brothers meant things for evil, but God means it for good, and we're going to be looking at that eventually. So did the grace of God work in this situation and bring about Dan. Dan means judge in Hebrew. Dan means judge in the Hebrew. Look at verses 7 to 8. It says, then Bilhah conceives again, and this time what does she name her son? Naphtali. Naphtali literally means wrestling in the Hebrew, and thus it fits in with what she says. With mighty wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister and have prevailed. And while the previous verses demonstrate how strained and contentious Rachel's and Leah's relationship was, verse 8 makes it even more apparent. Rachel is proudly. What's plowed? Proudly, thank you. Rachel is proudly flaunting her prevailing over Leah because her servant has had a second son compared to Leah's 4 sons. Rachel might not understand the idea of keeping score here or having a winning score, but her statement does put her jealousy and the reasons for her actions just on full display. Now, some translations for verse 8 say something like this. In my wrestlings with God, I have wrestled with my sister and won, and she named him Naphtali. The actual Hebrew here is Elohim, so this could refer to God, or as it does in some cases in the Old Testament, it could simply mean mighty or great. Commentators have said that if it could be translated or should be translated as wrestlings with God, then we should understand it to mean that Rachel was going to God in prayer to best her sister, and has again believed that Bilhah having another son means that God is working on her behalf. That's how she would be wrestling with God. She'd be wrestling with him in prayer. Still, I think it's a better translation to say mighty wrestlings because she has been contending with her sister. Still, this is either a statement of pure jealousy, or it is a statement of the ends justifying the means and jealousy. Either way, Rachel is not being cast in the greatest of light here. Let's look at verses 9 to 13 again. Leah saw that she had ceased bearing children. She took her servant Zilpah, gave her to Jacob as a wife, and so on. So we're switching back over to Leah's perspective. God has blessed her with 4 children that she was able to bear all by herself. She has ceased bearing children, but she's content, right? She doesn't need to compete with her sister. She recognizes God's blessing in her life, and she's willing to accept them as is and doesn't need anything else. Right? No. Unfortunately, what God gave her wasn't enough for her. I think Leah should have been content with God's providence in her life, but her rivalry with Rachel is too great. And when we hold up the Bible to ourselves like a mirror, we can be a little uncomfortable here. Now, we may not be like this now, but I bet that there may have been some times in our lives where we could have been and should have been content with what God has given us, only for us to want more because, well, maybe out of here, maybe because we were competitive or jealous, or maybe just because we wanted more. I know I've been that way sometimes. I've been no better than Rachel or Leah or Jacob in this passage. We need to always remind ourselves to be content with God's provision in our lives. That's our next lesson out of this passage. And again, most of these lessons are things that they didn't do. These are the opposite of what they did. And so, who does she give to Jacob to bear more children? Her servant, Zilpah. And even worse, Jacob is again complicit in this. But again, out of this come another couple of sons. Which 2 do we get in this verse? Gad and Asher. Yep. Gad in the Hebrew means luck or fortune. Asher is essentially a synonym for Gad. It also means fortune. And so Leah has the same amount of success that Rachel had through her servant. By now, there are 8 sons in Jacob's family. And then the situation turns to a new low for this family. Look at verses 14 to 16. Rivalry and jealousy continue in this household. One object of this passage, I believe, is to demonstrate just how evil bigamy, meaning having 2 wives, can be. And yet again, even in the midst of constantly sinning in this family, God is using these actions to lay a foundation for the 12 tribes of Israel and to rapidly increase Abraham's descendants. By this time, Reuben must have been around 4 to 7 or so years old. Since he was the firstborn and 7 children were conceived and born after him, some time must have passed in the last 15 verses. And so here we see him out in the field, following after the reapers, and he gathers the yellow berries of the mandrake, which are about the size of a nutmeg. The Hebrew word for mandrake is dudaim. The root of this word refers to love apples. Back then, people regarded this fruit as an aphrodisiac and as helping with fertility or procreation. So in other words, eating of this fruit would make it easier to have kids. Do you understand why Rachel now wants these mandrakes? This is what Reuben brought to his mother Leah. And Rachel must have been present for this. Now, how was Rachel described in verse 1? Rachel is what? Is what? Envious, yes. No, I must have picked the wrong verse for this. The answer I was going for is that she was barren, but yeah, she was barren. Where did I?
31.
Thank you. Verse 31 of chapter 29. Maybe that's one of the reasons I remembered to go back. But she was barren. And here was a fruit that could help her, that she thought could help her have kids. And so she naturally asked for some of the mandrakes. So if you could describe Leah's response to that question in a word or two, what would it be? We're back on verse 15. If you could describe her response in verse 15 in a word or two, how would you describe it? Competitive. Frustrated. Yeah. Yep. I'd go with curt. Bitter. Maybe even angry, among others. I mean, all these are good words. See, Leah questions why Rachel was not content to have taken her husband from her, but now even wants the mandrakes from Reuben. It shows that Leah's hope at the end of chapter 29, that Jacob would love her because she has borne him sons, has still not come true, even after Reuben has gotten a bit older and more children have been born. And so Rachel proposes a bargain. Scripture here is just very blunt. Rachel wants the mandrakes so Leah can sleep with Jacob that night. This is indelicate at best. Leah apparently agrees and bluntly goes to Jacob and says that she's bought and paid for him that night. How awkward is that? But I think we can see in both of the sisters' actions that they are desperate. Leah is desperate for love. Rachel is desperate for children. And neither of them are going to God. They continually try to accomplish this in their own strength. And then for the first time in this chapter, we see God specifically act. The start of verse 17 says, God listened to Leah. Now, of course, he's been working throughout this whole chapter up to this point. But here it's explicitly said, God listened to Leah. What does that presuppose? What does that assume? God listens to Leah. I can't hear you. that Leah prayed to him, or at least was talking with him. It assumes that Leah finally did go to God in prayer, or at the very least, the cry of her heart went to God. And so she has another son whom she names Issachar. The name Issachar means there is reward in the Hebrew. And it embodies Leah's idea that God has rewarded her for giving her servant to Jacob. Now, one commentator, in looking at what Leah says in verse 18, says this: Leah actually believes that when she so humbled herself as to grant her handmaid to her husband for offspring's sake, God recognized her sincerity and is now rewarding her for it. Truth and error blend in that opinion. God may indeed have recognized her humble unselfishness, but God does not sanction bigamous actions or rivalry. So, Leah has another son, and the rivalry continues. Verse 19, Leah conceives again and has a sixth son, Zebulun, which means dwelling. Her statement in verse 20 is a kind of pun. I like these types of things, so I point them out. A literal translation from the Hebrew says, God has presented me with a good present. In other words, God presents a present. And a similar word in the Hebrew for present, I bet you've all been wondering what these random markings are at the bottom. So, a similar word for Hebrew, this is the word present in Hebrew. This is the word dwell in Hebrew. Some commentators have wondered if over the years this has just kind of gotten lost in some manuscripts, and then they look very similar, right? If you take that one little line off, it's different marker. These are two different words, but removing that one little top of the line, it's a lamed there. And this is a dalet. If you take that off, it looks almost the same. So, very similar words. This one is present, the other one is dwell. Now the ESV translates dwell to be honor, but dwell is the better word. Leah truly wants to have a true marriage and relationship with Jacob. She says, God has endowed me with a good endowment, presented me with a present. Now my husband will honor me. It should be, now my husband will dwell with me. Finally, we're told that Leah also had a daughter named Dinah. This is to prepare for the events that will happen in chapter 34. The name Dinah is about the same in meaning as Dan and could mean even vindication. Verse 22 opens up with the statement that God remembered. This statement shows that Rachel's conception and pregnancy was not due to the mandrakes, but to the power of God, who is the author of all life. So again, I like how they point this out. Rachel tries to accomplish her pregnancy in her own way. She gets these mandrakes, and she thinks, now I'm going to get pregnant. And when we finally find out that she does get pregnant, it doesn't say anything about the mandrakes. It says, then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. It was God who did this. God only. And and then it says this, God listened to her. Just like it says Leah, that God listened to Leah, God listened to Rachel. So what does this presuppose again? Yeah, that she at least, again, has finally gone to him and asked or prayed to him, or that the cry of her heart went to God. And Rachel's response to this seems to be humble here. She gives God the glory and rejoices that he has taken away her reproach. Being sterile in that culture brought reproach or criticism and blame. I know people feel that way even today. People look down on a woman that had no children. It was believed that God thought that that woman was unworthy of children. And so Rachel is thankful that God had brought an end to that through having Joseph. And when you live with that stigma in that culture, you can kind of see a lot of the motivation behind Rachel's actions. Yeah, Gracia was saying that Sarah, Rebecca, and Rachel were all barren. They didn't have children until God basically opened their wombs and allowed it. Again, it's God who is in control of the covenant and seeing it through. And so Rachel is thankful that God has brought an end to her barrenness, and she prays that God would grant her another son. And she packs that prayer of thanks and a prayer for more all into the name Joseph. Joseph is connected to the Hebrew word asaph, which means to take away, and also to the Hebrew word yasaph, which means to add. So you have within the same words to add and to take away. Reminds you of that verse, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. We're going to stop here for tonight at this part in the chapter. But again, let's review the lessons that we learned. And again, we learned them from what not to do. First, bring the problem to God and seek His direction rather than trying to fix a problem ourselves. The Bible teaches us that what we should do, and it also gives us lessons and examples of what not to do. Resist the temptation to believe that the end justifies the means. And finally, be content with God's provision in our lives. Any other questions, comments, or insights into this part of the chapter? Yeah. Yeah, and by the time Rachel finally had a child, Leah had six sons and 2 additional sons by her servant. Yeah. You can see why Rachel was jealous, right? I mean, this is a natural human reaction for sure, right? Yeah, and Leah was jealous of Rachel because her husband loved her. And so, but you know, when you view this chapter specifically, or this part of the chapter specifically, it really highlights one of the reasons why one of the 10 Commandments is thou shalt not covet, right? We see what coveting turns into. One-upmanship that just goes further and further down. All right, well, that's all for tonight. We will continue on with the rest of chapter 30 next week. Have a good week.